Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to a special episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the ingredients, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. What you've happened upon here is one of my occasional special episodes of the Film Stories podcast. I really love doing these. It's when I bring along a filmmaker to talk about their latest release or a body of work. And in this case, I'm delighted to be joined by Oscar nominee John Madden, the director of films such as Shakespeare in Love, Mrs. Brown, Miss Sloane, Captain Corelli's Mandolin, The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, and more recently 2021's Operation Mincemeat, which is first and foremost what we're going to be talking about. So bits of necessary scene setting to do here. Operation Mincemeat came out in 2021, stars Colin Firth, Matthew McFadden, Kelly MacDonald, Penelope Wilton, Johnny Flynn and Jason Isaacs. We mentioned the name Michelle Ashford a couple of times. Michelle Ashford is the screenwriter of Operation Mincemeat, which in turn is based on the book by Ben McIntyre. The film played in cinemas early in the UK in 2022 and proved to be a box office hit, and it's now available on DVD, Blu-ray and video on demand services as well. Other bits and bobs we're going to talk about in the conversation that I'll just again set the scene for. I mentioned the name Ol Parker a couple of times. Now, Ol Parker worked with John Madden writing The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel and the second Best Exotic Marigold Hotel films. I've done a previous In Conversation episode with Ol Parker as well, where he talks about working on those movies. A really fascinating chat. I also mentioned the film Captain Corelli's Mandolin, which John Madden stepped in to direct when his friend, the late superb British director Roger Michell, for health reasons, had to pull out fairly late from directing that movie at a point where Nicolas Cage was already cast in it. So we touch on that a little bit as well. I do talk about the film Mrs. Brown, which really was a breakthrough for John Madden. It stars Judi Dench and Billy Connolly. That dates back to the later 1990s. And the other movie we talk about a little bit is 2016's underseen, really, Miss Sloane, starring Jessica Chastain. And the context of the release of that film was John Madden and his team made a very political film, and then they released it in the midst of, wherever you stand on the politics, in the midst of Donald Trump's rise to power in the US. And as you're going to hear, that had a negative impact on the response to the film, particularly how many people were inclined to go to the cinema to watch a political movie at the point politics was pretty much exploding in real life. That's all the scene setting you need, really, he says, realising he's done about 90 seconds of scene setting. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to launch pretty much into the chat with John Madden. I found him really fascinating. I hope you do too. I'm going to play you just a clip from the trailer of Operation Mincemeat, and then you'll hear my conversation with John Madden, the other side of this.
In 5 weeks, 100,000 British forces will strike Sicily's southern shore. Unfortunately, the Nazis know of our intentions. So we're going to play a humiliating trick on Hitler. We have to convince Germany that our target is Greece. The plan begins in Spain, where a corpse will wash up on shore bearing classified letters.
A corpse carrying fake documents.
Given the fascist network there, we could quite literally float the documents right into enemy hands.
Prime Minister, that's too big a risk. The fate of the world is at stake.
The plan is highly implausible. So when can it be ready?
Well, what say we start with the easy part and find ourselves a corpse?
So that is a clip from Operation Mincemeat, and I'm delighted for this special episode of the podcast to be joined by its director, as well as the director of a whole load of other things I'm hoping we get to talk about, John Madden. John, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Simon.
And where do we find you, and are you in good health, and is the world treating you right?
Should I answer those backwards? Yes,
okay.
The world is treating me fine, thank you. I'm in North Norfolk, is where I'm speaking from, and all good.
Excellent. And I mean, I always find it's interesting talking to a filmmaker a few months after the release of their film, and you've kind of moved away from the initial junket circuit that surrounds it, and you get I don't know, I mean, from your point of view, this was presumably in your head and your life for such a long time.
Yes.
And I just wonder what happens in these months afterwards. Do you get much time to reflect on the release now it's in your rearview mirror a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this one's such a strange one. It was in everybody's life because of the effectively 2-year interruption that was the pandemic. And as far as this film is concerned, we were very lucky in one way because we wrapped the film in Spain about 4 days before the Spanish lockdown, which is one of the first after Italy. And so we sort of came back off the end of shooting the film into a sort of very bizarre kind of circumstance in the UK, which it rapidly became clear that we would have to edit the entire film in a way that nobody had ever thought one could edit a film before. So I repaired up here, my editor was in London and so forth, and then we edited the film remotely for a year together without ever being in the same space. So it meant, and then following that, the resurgence of the Omicron variant and so on, meant that the experience of the film was extended over a long period of time. And so its tail, which is what you're already talking about, as the sort of experience of the film tapers off, is a longer one than it might otherwise have been. Because it was just a long wind up eventually to the film coming out into the light. But it is always interesting when you look back in retrospect, and I'm only just beginning to do that because I had put it down for a while and other things have intervened. And you're the occasion for doing it, so that's probably good. But it's not like it becomes a different animal. It's just that you can see things very clearly.
I've spoken to collaborators. I mean, I had a really lovely long chat with Ol Parker at one point. And you always come across as someone who thrives on the human interaction of making films. I don't know whether I'm reading that incorrectly, but I just wonder. I just wonder what that post-production edit is, where, I mean, I don't know what your internet connection's like in North Norfolk. I hope it's strong, but to take the humans out of the room and have to do it in that kind of way, because that sort of seems to go against you a little bit.
Well, it's a perfectly good question. The experience of making films is a sort of collaboration and a communal and entirely democratic process that isn't really like any other. And I'm not one of those people who hates the process of filming, and a lot of people describe that as like the war and they can't wait to get out of it. I don't feel that way at all. I just love the way the experience of making the film, which obviously has to emanate from me since I'm the one who's supposed to say this is the way we're going, just becomes vested in everybody around you because they're all aiming at the same thing. So it's a very, very special feeling. As far as the editing is concerned, that might have been a very difficult call if I didn't already know the editor. In this case, Victoria Boydell, who I'd cut the second Marigold film with, talking of Ol Parker. And so where she and I've been sitting, over her right shoulder for a long, long time and going and fetching her a cup of tea while she clicked around with the mouse and so forth. And the only difference really of the situation that we were in here is that I couldn't offer her a cup of tea. I could offer her one, but I couldn't bring her one since we were 150 miles apart. But that's one of the revolutions, of course, that we're all now used to, which is that Zoom, it's second best in size, but in other ways, it's cleaner, simpler. I'd never met you, but I say hi to you on the screen, and it feels in a perfectly valid way for this sort of conversation, completely natural. You don't even stop and think about it. So I didn't miss that. I'm immersed, in that process as keenly as any other part of the process, if not more, really, because It's just you and the film and the editor. And that's the weird thing. It goes down from, whatever it is, 200 people who are working on the film together down to 3, me, the editor, and the editor's assistant. And that's really all it was. And every 3 months or so, I get a call from a producer saying, how are you doing? How are you doing? When are we going to do something? And so on, and then you're sharing it with them. And that's a little different. The other part that's different is that and uniquely on this one, we never had that experience of watching the film with an audience, that's the only part I really missed. Because particularly with a film like this, which has a mixed tone to it, and the subject matter has all sorts of odd angles and elbows in it in terms of comedic, almost absurdist moments to sort of thriller moments to procedural moments to action moments, all these kind of things. And it's very difficult to understand exactly how an audience is receiving that until you're sitting in a room with them, which of course is the one thing we could never do because cinemas were closed and you couldn't have people in the same space as you. Well, in the end, it worked out fine, but that was an odd one.
I was going to say I'm one up on you then because I did see it. I took my dad. I've seen it a couple of times. I took my dad, who enjoyed it enormously, and in return, 2 days after, he presented me with a Blu-ray of The Man Who Never Was, because he'd been racking his brains wondering where he'd seen parts of that story before.
Right.
And so I watched The Man Who Never Was after watching Operation Mincemeat. I found that really fascinating. And I enjoy both films a lot.
It's very good, The Man Who Never Was. Made at a different time for a different purpose, of course, largely.
Yes, and I don't think I'm going massively spoilery on it to say that the ending of The Man Who Never Was focuses more on the German effort in response to. I thought as a perspective story choice, I thought that was quite interesting. And it reminded me of something. It's a terrible segue, but I'm going for this. It reminded me of something where I think you said when you were making The Debt about how you were aware that there was another version of it, or more directly in that case, and that you went back to that source once you knew you were making it. And moved on. Yeah. And in this case, you, of course, had the source of Ben McIntyre's book as well and documents that have been unsealed. But I'm curious where you kick in. At what point do you think you've got enough from that to build the story that you and your collaborators want to tell?
Well, the relationship with The Man Who Never Was, it's always a very odd process when there is an antecedent, because this one was not what you would call a remake, really.
No, not at all. Not at all.
And I didn't mean it in any kind of defensive way. It just meant that it's the material itself, of course, was up until the moment that Ewan Montague, the character played by Colin Firth, obviously in our film, and by Clifton Webb in the original, this was all under wraps. It was top secret, and the original version, Man Who Never Was heavily vetted by the intelligence services, who didn't really want the story told, to be completely honest. And as a result, they had to create their own creative ways out of situations they didn't want to deal with, most particularly the identity of the body that they used. So I rather deliberately postponed the moment where I would see that film, just in order not to be finding myself in a place where I needed, I don't want to do that because that was done in the other film. I didn't mind if we overlap. Obviously we would overlap in certain ways. But mainly because the critical source material for us was the Ben McIntyre, extraordinary job of disinterring, if that's not the inappropriate word, the actual facts and story that went into this thing, which was, of course, after the release of all the documents from the official secrets vault. And so it was a different story that one had to tell. So really, that was the first place I started. That was enough for me and for Michelle Ashford and I to kind of fashion the story without reference back to that, which of course was made in a different context, was incredibly relevant and and I'm sure a very powerful story. It was a very successful film as well, because you were much closer to the event itself, and we're looking back on it from the other end of a telescope in a slightly different way, and so it's revisionist. But yeah, one of the things that was really interesting about when I watched the film, and something that had been kind of bugging me a little bit, was the degree of speculation that we felt we could allow ourselves with the material. And I was rather delighted to find, knowing actually what the story was in all its minute detail, that they were in exactly the same situation, even though you and Montague, the man at the center of the whole thing, essentially dreamed up a completely unknowable set of circumstances, including, an Irish Nazi sympathizer, to power the third act of their story, because it's one of the very odd things about this film as a shape, because, 2/3 of the way through the story, your key characters disappear from the action, more or less, because it goes elsewhere. So that was very interesting. The whole story is about speculation, isn't it? It's about guesswork. Yeah. It's about selling an idea that nobody knows if that's true or not true. And that obviously spreads into the creation of the screenplay and the creation of the film itself. And that's where it kind of takes wing, I think.
I mean, I'm no screenwriter and I'm no filmmaker, so forgive the question, but I wonder when you're stress testing a story like that, because as a simple audience member, there's nothing usually more unbelievable on screen than a true story.
Yes.
It just, I either A, completely don't believe it because the reason someone's made it is it's too good to be true, and then it turns out to be true, or B, I know where it's going because otherwise you wouldn't have made a film of it. And I just wonder, as the creator, I think you navigate that really skillfully in this, which is why I feel safe asking you. But I just wonder how much throughout the process those considerations permeate it. Because you said before that, the film starts with a few people, then you've got hundreds, and then it's back down to the 3. Is that ever present throughout that process?
It is, I think, testing it against a reality. Here's where you start with any film, fictional or a fictional adaptation of true story or whatever it may be, is just what is the process by which an audience becomes engaged in the story that is being told, or to use the terminology you just used, is, are you buying this? Are you believing?
Yeah, sorry, I've got a bit market trader on you there, haven't I?
No. It's absolutely true. That is exactly what happens. It's like some films you kind of go, no, sorry, not having this. Don't buy it, don't believe it. And for a director, it's always the hump you have to go over yourself. You think, well, is anybody going to believe this room now that I look around with everybody in it? Actually, it turns out that people do naturally believe in things until they don't believe in things. That people do actually enter a story, usually in the way that we all enter stories. Which is wanting to figure out what happens next. So, if you're doing your job well, with this one, it's interesting what you say about, well, we wouldn't have made it if it didn't end in a particular way. That's probably an idea that would be sitting there at the back of somebody's mind, and it's the job of the filmmakers to tell the story in such a way that question is not sitting in the forefront of your mind all the time you're watching it. But there's one very interesting fact about it, which is that it was, and it's absolutely fair to say, a turning point in the course of the Second World War, and a major turning point. But weirdly, precisely because of the way it ended, I'm trying not to spoil people here who might be seeing, a Blu-ray version of this rather than having not caught it in the cinema or something. Because of the way it ends, it's not actually very well known it's not the Battle of Britain, it's not the Blitz, it's not the Normandy landings, it's not Dunkirk, what have you. These things are firmly installed in the fabric of what makes up a sense of what the Second World War was. This one isn't, and because of that, there's an odd thing that happens, and this was attested to many times, that they get to the end of the story and they actually don't know how it winds up. They don't know how it actually unfolds, or how it, catastrophically, successfully, a mixture of the two, whatever it may be. And that actually worked hugely in favor of the film, because it's a film where it starts out in one place and you think, it's this, what an odd story this is.
Yes.
And then gradually the mood changes and the mood music changes, and the people who are creating this fiction start to get lost in the fiction that they're creating, which then engenders a new mood, until finally this story floats away from them. On
choice of words,
yes, and they lose control of it completely, and then they're in the same situation as the people they're trying to hoodwink, which is they don't know what's happening, and they don't know whether the story has landed in the way that they wanted it to, and what the knock-on effect of that is going to be. And then suddenly the movie moves into a sort of existential dread, as it were. So in that way, it's interesting, antecedents or otherwise, or true story or not. It is, of course, all true. That you can experience it in real time without too much reference backwards, if that's what your question really was.
Yeah. I'm just intrigued because there's, it's almost impossible to answer, but these things I would imagine have to be present throughout your process. And the way you explain that about, basically, it sounds like you worked out the beats and the bits that you needed to hit before you said yes to this. From the way you were talking there, you sort of knew it.
Well, yes, that's a perfectly valid question, because the initial creative connection was really between Michelle and myself, because Michelle came across Ben's book, which I'd heard of but hadn't read, and she and I had just worked together very intensely on something, and she gave me this book and said, read it and see whether you think there's a film there, because I think there is. And then you're trying to sort of wrestle with the beast and go, wow, how do you actually pull the various aspects of the story into a coherent narrative? And you have to keep asking yourself that question. And and the evolution, never mind the pandemic and all of that, the evolution of the script and the way it finally came into its kind of working form was quite a long process, where we were turning that around and looking at the different facets of the story for quite a long time.
Do you enjoy that process? I
do,
see a huge grin on your face. So I just
I do, because there's it's like solving a mystery on its own. It's not. I don't sort of necessarily like films that have a set, a railroad track that you've really just got to basically navigate that in the right way to tell the story properly. I kind of like stories where there are problems you have to solve, and there are, and that process actually goes on. It goes on in the writing, it goes on in the making, it goes on in the editing, and it goes on to the completion of the entire thing.
And is that, go on, sorry. I was going to say, is that experience learned for you? Because you've spoken candidly in the past about taking on Captain Corelli's mandolin from the late brilliant Roger Michell, who I know you were very close to. Of how it sounded like you hadn't got all those bits in place when you started on that film.
That was a tough one. Was a tough one. It really was a train that had already left the station when Roger had to step away from it. And my natural instinct in that circumstance is to think, that's not a problem. I'll be able to take this and reshape it and formulate it. But, it was already significantly cast in one major respect. So Nick Cage was cast in the lead, and so it's something which I embraced. And from then on, the reality of schedules and all of that, I suddenly realized, Lord, I've barely got my foot on the train, and I'm struggling to get to the guards van, and slow it down and stop it so I can do what I need to do. And I never was quite able to do that, to be completely honest. Not that I so it was tough because you're forced into a space where you're not perhaps quite ready to be in. I think that's the truth of it.
But do you learn from that? Does that affect what you do
Totally.
going forward?
Of course it does. Yeah, of course it does. I mean, everybody thinks directing is about control, and of course it is about that. But in a way, I would view it slightly differently and frame it slightly differently, which is that you want control of the elements that you're dealing with, but you also want to relinquish control when you then start to make it, because you have to be alive.
Interesting.
To mistakes, to discoveries, to what an actor does to a moment, to what a physical location does to a moment, all kinds of things like that. And if you haven't got to the comfortable space where you feel, in theory, you know how you want to make the film, that can become a slightly entropic experience where things are whizzing past you and you haven't really had time to consider them. So I think you do learn from experience. Of course you do. I always think everybody could make a film theoretically once, but whether they then have the wherewithal or develop the wherewithal to know, that's probably a fluke if you manage to do that. Thereafter, you need to know more and more and more what you're doing, I think, in order to produce something that the audience is worth, it's worth watching. If you see what I mean.
I mean, just one more thing on Mincemeat as well. I mean, this is a relatively crass question, but bear with me on it. Because the story that's not been told of Mincemeat since it came out was this was a box office hit. I mean, I've just been looking at the charts of what it was up against and the kind of money it was making in the UK. It's just like, this was a hit. I mean, no two ways about it. Conversely, I mean, I love Miss Sloane. I'm a huge fan of that film. I looked that up and it's like the first Google result tells me it's a box office flop. Well, that's the clickbait googly thing. So I'm not suggesting.
No. I wasn't even trying to defend that. I mean, that one, there's a weird one because, of course, that film
timing
collided with the cataclysm known as Donald Trump.
I've heard of him. Yeah,
exactly. So that turned that film upside down completely. It was totally weird. But you never know, do you, really, and how and when, what you've made sort of joins the forward flow of time and how that's going to work. And the circumstances can be so different. I mean, Warner Brothers with Mincemeat were doing an extraordinary sort of maneuver and dance to try and, stay beyond the disruptive effect of the pandemic. So we moved back, a couple of times we had to. But it's, it is very odd the way it works out. Very odd.
I mean, I guess the only thing on box office that, from my point of view, that to you is how much it matters beyond, is it enough to trigger what you want to make next? Does the immediate response to the film matter? Because you've got a body of work now where you must see responses to films you've done 20 years ago still coming through. And I'm just wondering where the immediate sits in your head.
Well, I think it's disappointing, with something like Miss Sloane. I'm talking about the UK. Well, actually, it's true in America as well, of course, because of Trump. Nobody wanted to see a political story at that.
Let's have some escapism and look what.
It's kind of. I suppose it's just whether it establishes enough of a presence for itself that people have, broadly speaking, heard of the film, and therefore go back to, are motivated to go and look at it if they haven't already seen it. So exactly the circumstance that occasions this conversation now. Where obviously you hope everything is going to be a runaway success. Yeah. Sometimes it is in ways that you hadn't expected. And in other cases, you kind of think, oh, that's too bad. It deserves more than that. But there's no way of knowing that. You're right. The longer your career, you're not necessarily judged totally by whether things rise or fall, because it becomes part of a kind of a continuum, I suppose. For me professionally, you just move on to your next thing. But it does affect I probably don't. I'm not in a rush to make another Second World War movie right now. Obviously,
no sequel then. You didn't leave it on a cliffhanger with a cinematic universe. And I think you've forgotten the rules for modern cinema there, haven't you?
Yes, trying to avert my eyes.
I'm pushing up to the edge of my time. I do wonder if I've just got time just to ask you about this.
Yes.
I first came to the attention of your film work. It wasn't immediately through the film. It was seeing Judi Dench and Billy Connolly on a chat show together.
Right.
And I remember sitting there thinking, who on earth has put those two together in a film? And then it remains to me one of the most majestic pieces of casting. If anyone talks to me about the art of casting, which obviously they don't, that is one of the absolute eureka. You would never sit in a room and instantly come up with that moment. And clearly that film was a huge turning point in your career as well. I think it was at the point where the BBC was making films like Enchanted April that it wasn't expecting to even put in cinemas.
Yes, it was a point where they were just slowly some films, Mike Newell or Stephen Frears were making films that were given a brief theatrical outing. Yeah, and we were part of that happening. Look, casting is everything, always. It's always the case.
That was my question in the midst of it all. It was a casting.
Well, no. It is, and not for nothing is it the first part of any process when you're putting a film together. You think, well, can this be cast? And can this be cast in a way that people say, we definitely want to make that because we definitely think people might want to see that. Yeah. And it was not necessarily, I'd love to say, we just searched far and wide in every direction to come up with that combination. Judi, was such a natural connection to that role. Yeah. Strangely, it's hard to turn time back now to remember that, but she hadn't played a lead in a theatrical film before. Yeah. And of course, at that point, it wasn't a theatrical film, it was a television film in which she certainly had played, leads in smaller films and had appeared in films, but not in a way that made her a kind of a movie star. But nevertheless, it was such a perfect piece of, pitch perfect accuracy in terms of what the actor brings. And after all, there aren't actors like her anyway. And Billy, coming from a completely different universe, which was a big risk, certainly, though he'd done some acting, but not at this sort of level. Also, as it turned out, was an incredibly good match for the character that he was playing. And I remember to this day, the very first scene that we shot with them both was the scene in the film where he arrives with his horse, or her horse, I should say, or a horse, the horse, and is presented to her in a situation where they've, is the kind of proposed answer to the problem of her, complete withdrawal from, a public life and the role of the Queen and so forth, because of this intense grief. It was a very, very strong scene in which Billy had like 20 lines that were just monosyllabic along the lines of I ma'am, no ma'am, I ma'am, and so forth. And it was just that glorious thing of watching an actor, on a screen and just feeling a tremendous kind of sense of fulfillment and relief and delight that he was instantly real in that moment without even trying. He just looked and felt like exactly that person, as far away from the person he was acting opposite as the story required him to be. And therefore that became part of the journey. And, they, as you know, from seeing him that talk show, they became incredibly good friends and a brilliant pairing.
It's interesting you use the word relief. Was it really that you you couldn't know for definite until you see them.
Well, he's Billy's a genius, and he's a genius in a totally different realm. And he and I talked about this before we started. He walks on stage, not so much now, obviously, but walks on stage in front of however many thousand people, and he knows nothing more than the first line he's going to say.
I've seen one of his gigs,
it probably enters his head as he's walking out on the stage. It's like he's just catching lightning in a bottle at the exact moment that he starts it, and he has no idea where he's going to go. He's just a born raconteur, and he slides from one idea to another. And watching him on stage, you're really seeing a sort of genius at work. But give him a fixed script.
Yes,
which most of us would say, "Thank God I've got a script, and I know what to say, and I can do all of this." To him, is terrifying. It terrified him because that means he's got to hit the note in exactly the right way, and that's not his experience. So the relief was a joint relief, not a relief with me looking at Billy. It was a relief of thinking, "Oh, this will be just fine." He if we can make that connection. And obviously there were moments where he needed more guidance, including the last line of that scene. But he's incredibly intelligent, incredibly instinctive. And gradually, as the film unfolded, the sort of awkwardnesses of that relationship evolved into something very special on screen, because it often mapped what was going on. The sort of embarrassment of emotion expressed from somebody miles above him in status. Obviously Billy bows to no one in a kind of a natural terms, but all of that just worked incredibly well. Judy just loved it. Loved it. It was just...
You could tell that from the chat. I can still remember it in great detail. That chat show. Quite a show. John Madden, thank you so much for letting me overrun and chat to you. You do not disappoint. Huge congratulations on Operation Mincemeat, and you are welcome back on this podcast anytime.
Thank you, Simon.
And thank you indeed, John Madden. And thank you to you for listening as well. That brings to the end my conversation with John Madden. Operation Mincemeat is available on DVD, Blu-ray, and on video on demand services here in the UK. And it's available now. I do recommend checking it out as well. And I will try and get John Madden back on the podcast to ask him all the rest of the questions I'm really interested in asking him too. I did find him a really interesting man to talk to. But that brings me to the end of this special episode of Film Stories, so I won't elongate it by waffling too much. Instead, I'll just tell you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. Our website, filmstories.co.uk, is updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, and what kind of mayhem we're up to. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, meanwhile, that's where you can find our assortment of print magazines. There are lots of them. And also our Sneakers Blu-ray. More details on that there. Facebook.com/filmstories, online, youtube.com/film stories. I think that's it, really. If you particularly like this podcast, I really hope you do. Please subscribe. Please ideally leave a hugely positive review. If you really like this podcast, I'm at patreon.com/Simon Brew, and you can support it financially there as well. But without further ado, I'm going to leave you in peace. I'm going to thank you for your time. Please all look after yourselves. You all take care. I'll be back soon with a regular episode of Film Stories. You all look after yourselves. Bye-bye.